Are we merely biological and chemical processes acting at random in a vast void? Or are there other forces at work, a creator or a god, that create and guide life? These are questions that have guided us throughout human history, no matter our influences and beliefs. St. Thomas Aquinas, a 13th-century Italian Dominican friar, who would become the patron saint of students, penned his rationale for the existence of God in his book Summa Theologica, where he details the 5 arguments regarding the existence and quantification of a higher order. Here to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas' findings is Eric Bess. Eric Bess is a practicing representational artist. He is currently a doctoral student at the Institute for Doctoral Studies in the Visual Arts, and he also writes on art, culture, and philosophy. Thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you for having me. So I guess I'll get right into it and talk a little bit about Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas has an interesting life story. He actually was the son of a very wealthy family who wanted him to become part of the Roman Catholic Church, but he resisted this. There was a new order, the Dominican order, that was interpreting Christianity in a different way. Aristotle's texts had just been rediscovered, maybe about 100 years or so prior to this, or at least the previous century. So a lot of people were investigating these texts and trying to pull any type of ideas that they could from it. And Aquinas became interested in Aristotle and what the Dominican order could offer him. And he researched a lot, excuse me, he studied a lot, so much so that his family, the story goes that his brothers locked him in a room for a year and even tried to tempt him with prostitutes to get him to no longer be a part of this order or research the things he was researching. And he was able to resist. He supposedly chased the prostitutes out of his home with a stick of fire from his fireplace. And then after they left, he, with the burnt wood, drew a cross on the wall to reinforce his faith. And recognizing his strong will, his brothers gave up. So he went off to research Aristotle. His goal, though, wasn't just to research Aristotle. There were 2 branches of thought at the time. There was the Roman Catholic Church, which had a very strict interpretation of the Bible, and there was the philosophical and scientific approach to reality, which is where Aristotle came in. Aquinas was not interested in following either one absolutely. One was based on reason, which was the philosophical and scientific approach, and the other was based on faith, which was obviously the Catholic Church approach. He wanted to see if maybe these two could be combined. They could balance one another so that they weren't mutually exclusive. And for the most part, at least during that time, he was very successful until the philosopher Erasmus comes and tries to pull those two apart again. But from here, I'll go into what some of his argument is, starting with his metaphysics and how he tries to bring these two things together. He, instead of starting with faith to prove the existence of God, he instead starts with reality, the things in front of us, which takes reason, our intellect, to try to find our way back to God from where we currently stand,
Okay,
which is
that's
interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting approach, and one up until that point that really wasn't taken, at least not in those times. There are other philosophers who try to take that approach, but they're not doing it to prove the existence of God. They're doing it to try to find some other type of truth. Socrates does it, for instance. Plotinus, who is a Neo-Platonic thinker, does it, where they start with what's in front of them and then try to prove something like justice or truth or beauty.
Yeah, in the 13th century Italy, believing the existence of God pervaded nearly all of society and culture. So, do you have any insight as to why Aquinas tried to reason through the existence of God in his time?
Yeah, so my understanding is, again, he's trying to bridge this divide. So Aristotle is talking in terms of actions and how we can become who we are by way of character or virtue. So he talks about a virtue ethics. The Catholic Church, however, has a dogmatic, rule-based set of ethics. So Aquinas is trying to find a bridge between these two, and his proofs of God is kind of like a way of bridging that divide.
Okay.
So instead of saying, "Oh well, we just have to do these things because God says we have to do them," instead he's saying we can actually reason our way to understanding why we have to do these things, while simultaneously proving the existence of God, which is the reason why we have to do these things. So his metaphysics, and that is just the how he's coming to understand the way things are, or why things are the way they are. I'm going to just bring up some key phrases and talk about them a little bit and try to interpret them, or at least relate them in a way that's understandable. So he says that there are substances. There are primary substances, there are secondary substances, and there are accidental substances. A primary substance is the character a thing takes on. So an object, for instance. So you and I are human beings. The humanness of our being is our primary substance. Right? A secondary substance would be the thing that we are, for instance, like a human body.
Okay.
So the form that our body takes, kind of. An accidental substance is something that is a part of our primary substance, but is not necessary for that substance to exist. So for instance, if you, maybe this isn't the best example, but if you were to chop my arm off, the fact that my arm is now gone from my body does not make me any less of a human being. I still have my humanness, even though my arm is gone.
Yeah, I get you.
So my arm would be an accidental substance that's added onto the primary substance of me being a human being. And from this, there are two things to consider. There's form, which is the actuality of something. So my form, that is my body as a human being, is the actuality of my humanness. And matter is the potentiality of form. So he kind of relates it in this way. All human beings, for the most part, have the same form. You can look at a human and judge that it's a human based upon its form. Matter, however, is the subtle differences within that form, so that I can differentiate you from someone else, for instance, that is also a human being. So matter can arrange form in different ways, but form is the characteristic of a certain species or genre, or category of something. And it's often how we make judgments about things, which will become important later on. And then there's the way we come to define things, which is the essence of something versus its actual existence. So this again kind of goes back to form versus matter. But the essence of something can be what something is. So what is it to be a human being, for instance, which is a great question that actually a lot of philosophers start with. What does it mean to be a human being, or what is a human being in relation to other types of being? And essence for Aquinas is not the same as existence necessarily. So a unicorn has an essence in that we can define it in what it is, but it doesn't necessarily exist. an existence of something doesn't necessarily mean that you understand its essence, which is pretty much the basis of a lot of scientific inquiry anyways, in that you can only really know something until you, unless you found it. If you find it, then you can study it as an object in front of you. Otherwise, you know nothing about it. So Aquinas says that all of that is that one doesn't necessarily translate into the other, except for in the case of God, where God is both. And this is where we'll get into the 5 proofs of God. So 5 is God is both. God is essence and existence simultaneously. And God says this in the Bible, that, I am what I am. And Aquinas sort of takes this and moves forward, and that God is simply to be.
Yeah, and this just brings something to mind. If we look at the theory of the Big Bang, they're finding many holes within that theory. Given the age of material spread unevenly throughout the universe, different ages, the further we go out, so it doesn't line up. And we've been focusing on this existence aspect in all this research, but only recently have all these fields of study combined to consider the essence of the origin of our universe. As an example, there's now an alternate theory apart from the singularity theorems relying on a singular mass that we're used to hearing about. One mass substance that blows, and from that it expands and expands to create the universe that we exist in. But now these uh, alternate theories, multi-dimensional theories, are saying it's more like a wave or a structured intent, and it pervades everything. So it's all places at all times, throughout everything, and everything is contained in this wave, or it's a will, if you will. So the creating can happen within this all the time. So it's basically what you said about God saying, "I am what I am." The originator of essence and existence that can create from the original source back to what we can perceive in our reality and our world. So in this Big Bang theory, we have to understand something coming from nothing. And when we try to build our reality on that concept, we run into these gaps in our understanding of gravity and consciousness and things like that. There's so many things we could go into in that, that there are holes there that we can't really understand or get any kind of answers to. So we just kind of don't think about it. But I just thought that was interesting, way to understand, maybe our relationship to this figure, creator or God. So
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And it seems to be, at least I think, what Aquinas is saying, that God is not a being that is separate from the world, for instance, a being that's sort of like with a big long white beard out in the Netherlands of space, but instead God is existence itself. And he comes to this conclusion to these 5 proofs. The first proof is the proof of motion, which is a tricky word because he doesn't mean that, for instance, I got into my car and I moved from point A to point B. He means just change in general. So the shift that occurs moment to moment, he says that that shift cannot occur of its own accord. So a moment cannot shift into the next moment by its own effort. Instead, something had to cause the moment before it. He says that you can do that though forever. You could go back an infinite amount of moments. But if you do that, you really haven't proven anything. You really just end up, where you start. It becomes a type of circular reasoning in a way. Instead, he says that there has to be a first mover, someone who initiates this change, who also remains unmoved if they are the first mover. And he says that we call this person or this thing God. It's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, just another side point in this, which I found kind of interesting is, yeah, that characteristic we like to assign to God as being a singular being. But if we look at it in terms of it being, God being basically a part of everything, like, so in that sense, we are also part of that matter. And that just comes to mind that scene in The Matrix where this little kid was asking Neo to bend the spoon,
Mhm.
and Neo's like, "How can I do that?" You don't bend the spoon. You just realize it's kind of like a part of you kind of thing, and
Mhm.
then you can bend the spoon because we're all essentially a part of that substance or whatever you want to call it, wavelength that is the original creator. So like that kind of expands that whole notion of what God is and how we can relate to it. So
Yes, yes. It's like God is manifesting constantly, moment to moment, at every moment. And the creation did not occur in the first moment and then stop and then everything just sort of carried on. Instead, it just seems to continuously happen, which is it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to consider. So the second proof is cause. There's a first cause, which is very similar to the first proof. As a matter of fact, the first four proofs have to do with cause and effect. Second one has to do with cause in that we cannot be the causes or objects, period, cannot be the causes of their own existence. Instead, something else has to cause their existence. And the thing that causes existence has to exist in and of its own self. Otherwise, it too would have a cause for its existence. And the thing that is of its own self is God, or that's what we call it. I find these interesting. Being in the art world, I come across a lot of people who say that they're self-taught, which is an I've always found an interesting thing to say. And every time I hear it, a little part of me just sort of dies on the inside. I just feel like it's such a self-absorbed statement to make, because it implies that you already had the knowledge necessary to teach yourself something that you did not know. but, but that makes no sense at all. I even had someone not too long ago.
Well, I'm pretty sure they didn't think about it that way, but
Yes, no, you're right. You're right. Like I had someone not too long ago tell me that they're self-taught by watching videos on YouTube, and I nodded. But I thought to myself, like, no, actually, like YouTube is what taught you, and the people who devoted their time to whatever it was you were watching taught you, and it's okay to give these people credit for that. This is a little off topic, but it just seems like what people are attempting to do is elevate themselves in a position as if to say I am worthy because I was able to do this of my own efforts. But Aquinas would find issue with this. He would say, I don't, it doesn't seem to be the case at all. Instead, there seems to be a cause for every effect. And there's always something else that's moving you, or the cause of your existence that's outside of yourself, that's external to yourself. So yeah, anyways, that's the second proof. The third proof is the proof of contingency. And what it appears like he's saying is that everything in reality, because he's starting with what he's perceiving, is not necessary as far as existence is concerned. Not only is it not necessary, but it's also dependent upon everything else around it. So walking down the street, I'm dependent upon 1,000 things, not only my legs and the muscle fibers that are moving the legs and the electric signals that are moved to the muscle fibers and my mind that's having that happen and the learned ability to walk that was instilled in me through my parents, and et cetera, et cetera. I'm also dependent upon the ground, et cetera. We're just so dependent. And on top of that, I am not a necessary being for life to continue on. None of us are. Things would just continue on, or at least we could imagine that they would. So therefore, Aquinas says, the only way we can, the only reason we can even come to the conclusion that we do exist is that there is a necessary and independent being that sustains our existence.
And is this going back to the original when you're talking about being dependent upon things? Basically, it has to come from the first dependent of something, right?
Yes.
To build everything off of.
Yeah. So it's just like the other cause and effect, the first two. You could do that until the beginning of time. You could try to figure out, the dependency of things forever ago until you get to the point where there has to be something that's independent that initiates that first occurrence of cause and effect, and something necessary, because that thing would have to be necessary for everything else to continue to exist.
Yeah, and sorry, another point here with this one is with the first causation, people are looking into the substance of matter, basically like what is oxygen. They're actually finding out that it's actually these patterns that they're like energy or wavelengths that actually make it. So if you look at a substance like hydrogen or oxygen, it was actually these certain geometric shapes that exert a certain energy or radiance. Like protons and electrons are actually just energy.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're mission matched in a certain order, you have a certain molecule. And then that, there's relationships between them. Even between our stars, there's like a certain pathways. And going back to the original substance, or like our thoughts, they actually were able to kind of quantify them as like biophotons, where they're kind of saying that these could possibly be the substance of thoughts. They're faster than the speed of light, almost. It's simultaneous, and they're also in these geometric patterns and shapes. I'm not familiar with like water crystals, how they form certain pretty little pictures and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah. So with these wavelengths and our thoughts, there's all these certain ESP, extrasensory perception kind of things, where you can actually influence just by thinking about something. You can actually influence its matter. It could be on the other side of the planet or whatever. And so with the original intent, it could be, just a pattern wavelength or something like that from this original source that is everywhere at once. It manifests everything, and just from that one little ripple or pattern or something like that. So that's maybe another way to look at this. So
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It reminds me of a pseudoscientist I was researching once. His name is Dr. Masaru Emoto, and he did these experiments with thought, intention, and water, where he would put labels on water that had certain intentions on them, like kindness or hate or love. And then he would let these stay somewhere for a while, freeze them, take them out, and then study what they would look like under a microscope. And the water crystals under a microscope that had positive thought intentions associated with them crystallized into a design that was very ordered and what we would typically call beautiful. The ones that had negative associations with them were deformed and almost like blob like, or like like an explosion happened on the slide. And so there were quite a few people who dismissed his experiments, and another doctor, his name is Dean Radin, did a double-blind study on it, where he had people stay in a room and had water bottles. They didn't know the location of the water bottles, and pretty much conducted the same experiment. Froze these water bottles with intentions on them. He actually had people, if I remember correctly, sort of just direct their thoughts. Certain rooms would have thoughts of love or whatever, and other rooms would have thoughts of hate, etc., etc. Then they took these slides, instead of showing them to the same people that they had do the thought intentions, they instead had a different group of people from all around the world look at these slides and determine whether or not they thought that they were beautiful. And there was a 3% differential on these slides, which is a big difference as far as thought intention and aesthetics. That is, whether or not we consider something beautiful, associated with the positivity or negativity of the thought. Which
Cool.
is, that's really really fascinating. At least I find it very fascinating that maybe there is some type of order or design that's integrated within existence itself, which actually gets to the fifth proof, even though we skipped over the fourth, but since it sort of ties into what we're talking about anyways. The fifth proof, Aquinas says that things in existence seem to lack intelligence, but yet they still consistently fulfill whatever their purpose is. And these are things at all levels of existence. So Aquinas would say, like, plants, for instance, are a lower level of existence than animals, and animals are a lower level of existence than human beings. The plants still do what they do. They fulfill their purpose, and they do so consistently. Why is that? Especially if they have no intelligence that we're aware of. At least in his time, there was no intelligence as far as he was concerned. Animals have intelligence as far as the things that they're able to do, that is instinctual intelligence, but they don't have a rational ability to discern or choose amongst things. And yet they still seem to fulfill whatever their purpose is on earth. And the same with human beings who have an intellect and they're able to fulfill their purpose on earth. There seems to be a design, some type of order that's holding all of this together. And since none of us are intelligent enough to design all of this ourselves, then the causer of this intelligent design, we would call God. So the fourth proof is perfection. So we're going to backtrack a second. And perfection is another cause. It's the last cause and effect proof that Aquinas has. And he essentially suggests that we, as human beings, are able to discern good and bad within existence. We're able to look at something and judge it as good or bad based on whether or not it fulfills its purpose. So a chair is good, for instance, insofar as it allows me to sit in it. A chair is not good if it does not accomplish that. So he says that we can do that with our minds, just on the understanding of the primary substance of what a chair is, its isness. What is a chair? And because of that, we can also think of a perfect chair. But there is no perfect chair in nature. So where is this perfect chair? Where does it stem from? And this is kind of a Platonic argument, in that we can consider perfection absent there being a perfect anything, as far as we know. And this perfection has to stem from something that is perfect. And this something that is perfect, we would call God.
Yeah, this gets into a lot. We could ask a lot of questions here. One that comes up is, well, say, there's an order to everything, and it's something that we can't really manage ourselves. I mean, we can't split atoms and do all that fun stuff. I mean, yeah, we can do that. We can't create things that can function in the way that our world does. I think it's like 1 to the 100 trillionth or something crazy number of probability that our existence doesn't explode into massive fission, just everything gets wiped out kind of stuff because of just the imbalance of energy and molecules and all that stuff. That's not something we can do, but we do create in this world, though, in this universe that we exist in. So in that sense, we're kind of like co-creators in a way, because we are creating substances and things via our existence. So I don't know. I mean, you're an artist, right? So
Yes.
you're creating things to fulfill a certain purpose. So in a sense, you're also taking part in this. How do you see that in line with maybe what Aquinas is saying here is the proof of God and everything being ordered and structured?
All right, so that's fantastic. So Aquinas, from my understanding, would suggest that of course we do. Of course we do, because we are trying our purpose in life as human beings is to find union with God. And God being the ultimate creator, the closer we get to God, the more we are God-like or are in union with God. And this is where his ethics starts. So now we're getting to the virtue ethics, where he is saying that human beings are attempting to really be happy more than anything else. And he's taking this from Aristotle. But from the Catholic Church, he's saying that they find their happiness in God. So if God is the cause of everything around us, and God is integrated in everything, and God is existence itself, and if our happiness is or occurs in relation to our own existence, then our happiness must also occur in relation to God. And since God is the one who is the first mover, the first creator, because an object can't exist of its own accord, then the closer we get to God, or to what our existence is innately, the more in tune we are with our own ability to create. But for Aquinas, this creation is not a destructive type of creation, which actually is a very reoccurring theme in the history of philosophy, in that in order to create something, you have to destroy something. So, for instance, in order to create the chair, I have to destroy the tree, and from the tree, take the wood and fashion a chair. So the two seem to happen simultaneously almost, or at least one happens before the other, and that you have to destroy in order to create. Aquinas doesn't seem to think so as much. Instead, fashioning the chair is an act of love. So at least this is my interpretation of it. So he has his 7 virtues, cardinal virtues. 4 of them are natural virtues, which means that we ourselves achieve them through our own efforts. Prudence, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. Taking these 4 things and using our reason in conjunction with our will, we are able to achieve and progress in these 4 virtues insofar as they become part of our character. So it's not that they're rules that are given to us by the Roman Catholic Church, for instance. Instead, they are things that we as individuals have to try to understand and act in accordance with. And this is where his free will comes into play. We can reason out little details about things and refine our ability to embody these 4 things. And the more we're able to do that, the more we're able to create out of love as opposed to just destroying. I find this to be this is something I struggle with a lot, because this is what my education is primarily based in, is aesthetics and creating things. And it's hard to deny that when you create something, you destroy something else. Even if I'm painting on a white canvas, to fill the white canvas, I have to destroy the whiteness of the canvas in order to create the image. But I think for Aquinas, his argument would be, well, if you are creating in accordance with your purpose, which is to unify with God, then the image that covers the white canvas is an act of love. The white canvas isn't destroyed at all. If anything, it too is fulfilling its purpose as a foundation for the paint that you've covered the canvas with. And all of it together comes and fulfills its purpose. The paint, the brushes, me as a human being, the canvas, the easel, the environment, all of it together reaches, or at least a height of its purpose.
Okay, this is probably a stupid question, but like say the chair, say it's having a hard time, it can't really fulfill its purpose, it's only got 3 legs. Is it like the essence of, its intent is trying to be a good chair, but it's not really getting there? What would Aquinas say to something like that? Because I mean, obviously we're human beings. Am I a perfect human being? Absolutely not. In terms of, getting to that, reaching all these virtues and everything. And this chair here is falling short too. So what does Aquinas say about all this?
I think that's a great question. So I think he would say, if we go back to accidental substances, for instance, the absence of the chair leg does not make the chair not a chair. So the chair is still a chair, it's just not a very good one. So Aquinas would say that the chair retains its chairness, and that there are degrees of good. And this I found very interesting. I don't know quite what I think about it yet, but he said that evil is just the absence of good in degrees. So the less good you have in something, the more evil it becomes. And the more good you have in something, the more good it. What did I just say? Did I say that wrong? The less good you have in something, the more evil it becomes. Yes. The more good you have in something, the less evil it becomes. And the whole idea, which he calls natural law, which is the human being's ability to participate in God's law, which would be existence as such, would be to shun evil and pursue what is good. So if I am attempting to unify with God and I see a chair with 3 legs, and if I have the capacity, then fulfilling my purpose and the chair's purpose, I would evangelize the chair and add its extra leg for it.
Good for you. Yeah, and this was just like, kind of a stupid metaphor to get at the point that, with all these virtues and things like that, with, compassion, temperance, and everything like that, it is a certain like building force that is taking you out of a self perspective and more towards a universal one. Whereas things like this is kind of difficult because, say we go through a lot of trauma, we internalize everything, we constantly manifest it, we keep thinking about it, and it draws us into the self. This poor chair might have that same feeling, it's like, oh, I got 3 legs. I'm just, all this trauma is going on in this poor chair's mind, but it can fulfill its role in some way in by expressing itself through being beautiful or something like that, because it has, it's trying to do something for somebody else, and manifesting these principles, that offer more order and structure to the universe, and that helps everybody else. So, the chair is missing a leg, but it can help in other ways,
Mhm.
to establish this universal order and help other beings exist to fulfill their role. So,
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and I think that also goes back to the like what Aquinas is trying to do as far as laws are concerned. So if I have reason, because what you just did was reasoned out an explanation for other potentials for the chair, then I there's possibility, there's potential that can become actuality. But if I have a certain law that becomes dogmatic, then the chair can only be a chair if it fulfills a certain rule. And Aquinas seems, again, that he's trying to bridge that divide and say, well, yeah, the chair has to be a chair just in accordance with its chairness, but we can reason and potentially come to other possibilities in how the chair can fulfill itself in relation to God. So, the other three virtues are faith, love, and hope. So, I, as a human being, will take the four first virtues and, it, as far as my own effort, try to instill them into my character. These other three are just in relation to God. So, if the chair doesn't need a third leg or its fourth leg to have faith, love, and hope in God, according to Aquinas, if our chair is an analogy for a human being. So,
sorry.
no, you're fine. So, I as a human being can have faith in God, which Aquinas says is higher than reason, but reason can still explain things as far as God is concerned. But faith is a higher type of relationship with God, and of course, a love with God, which goes back to this selfless approach to things. Period. Because his understanding of God is that God is a selfless being, which is also interesting, considering that God is the first of everything. So God is the first of everything and is absolute, but is yet also just selfless, completely selfless. It's almost like that type of first moving, first creation, perfection, um, design. All of those five proofs can only occur, and even the virtues, which for Aquinas are characteristics of God that human beings fulfill, can only really occur if there is like an absolute selflessness, or the more you embody a selflessness, the more you become like this perfect being, which is existence itself. And hope in that is, so for Aquinas, you work for union with God while you're living, but you don't ever achieve it. You just hope that after death you will unify with God. So you have hope in God that God will see your efforts and they'll
Give
be
you
good
an extra
enough.
leg or something.
Yeah.
It's here.
Yeah. Oh man. But yeah, that
Sorry, just trying to figure out where to go.
uh, but that pretty much sums up a lot of Aquinas and my understanding of him so far.
And so going back to him putting forth all this info, how did people react to it at the time?
So there were quite a few people who resisted him. His views were very controversial. The Catholic Church did not want to accept Aristotle, and the philosophers did not want to accept the Roman Catholic Church. So this idea that you had to just accept things on faith wasn't popular amongst philosophers. And again, the Roman Catholic Church didn't feel like it was your place to reason truths of God. It was the church's responsibility to interpret scripture for you.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this is a lot of people have, credited Thomas Aquinas with kind of undoing the whole structure of fundamentalism within the Catholic Church. It really opened it up to it being a process of coming to understand something like a way of like a practice, instead of what Emperor Constantine wanted. He was a Roman emperor that basically kind of rewrote the Bible to make it more in line with turning people into good subjects, basically. And so here we have Aquinas basically taking us out of that again and putting it more towards a practice, a way of doing something. And he brings this when you start to question things too. I think that's really important in a spiritual practice, and this is going back into just the the virtues and things like that, because this chair with three legs. Say you have doubts about Christianity or something like that as you're practicing it. That actually helps to become stronger within it, because you question it and you have to go through that process, and that brings you to a deeper realization of it. So I don't know if Thomas Aquinas in his path, he devoted his entire life to understanding these things. So I don't know, do you think he had doubts about it to have such a strong faith?
That's a great question. I don't know. I do. He seems to have experienced visions that just like affirmed his faith for him. There was even, I believe, like toward the end of his life, he had a series of visions that he said was so intense that everything he had written was like straw, just almost insignificant. All that effort he had put into to prove the existence of God didn't even scratch the surface. And then he died shortly after that. But I don't know. I do think, at least as far as his, there had to be at least a point in his life. You know what? I don't know. I don't know. From everything I've read, he seems to have always been such a devout Christian. It's a very devout Christian, so much so that no one could deter him.
Yeah, and that's what I was kind of wondering too, because he just seems so focused, like one singular vision on this. And maybe that's why he was given all these visions and things like that, because he was so in accordance to what he was, his own faith. Maybe maybe didn't need doubt. There's this one, the idiom, when pigs fly.
Mm-hmm.
They attributed that to Thomas Aquinas when he was in seminary in school, when he was a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of tall and big and kind of really quiet, so people thought he was a little bit, I guess, dumb kind of thing. There's like always this stupid oaf kind of guy, and so the other kids would make fun of him all the time. And these kids, they went to the window one time and like, "Oh, Thomas, look, there's a pig flying out the window. Come look." And so Thomas, he got out of his desk and was like, "Okay, wait, I'll look." And he looked out the window, and they all laughed at him. It's like, "Thomas, you're so stupid. Pigs don't fly. Why would you?" And well, he turned to them and said, I'd rather believe that pigs could fly than believe that my own Christian brothers would lie to me."
Hmm.
And, that just shows his just indomitable character, even at that young age.
Hmm.
So I don't know, maybe he didn't have any doubt in his life. Maybe his faith was that strong. For me anyways, in my path of life, there's these ups and downs and things like that. So maybe I just can't relate to Thomas Aquinas and his singular vision, but that's just what's so what I thought anyways was so inspiring about him.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. You're right. He seems to be very focused. Uh, and I remember reading that story and just being like, wow, I'm a lot older than he was then, and I still find myself being affected by like what people may think of me.
Yeah.
Which is just it's isn't the best, but it's me being honest. But it's just sometimes I wish I could have that type of resolve and just faith in things that I believe to be right that I know I will be attacked for. And he didn't seem to have that fear at all. It's very inspirational.
Yeah, so in this sense, he's kind of fulfilling the virtues that kind of bring us more towards a oneness with this singular source, or what he was trying to prove. The existence of God in his Summa Theologica. So maybe he is kind of the manifestation of that. So I think he wrote that book for students just entering seminary.
Hmm.
Here's a book. This kind of lays out the path, to theology, and these are things you're going to expect. Here are the 5 proofs. So kids would read these, and then they would have kind of an understanding early on of this type of material. And they coined him, the patron saint of students and universities. Maybe because that's kind of he really kind of lays a foundation for this rationality and reason within faith. It kind of seems like his goal maybe was achieved then, because he did bridge that gap. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's even some more modern philosophers who consider him like the first Christian existentialist, just because he was able to ask deep questions, like you referred to earlier, and try to find a way to question existence itself, and from existence possibly move back to something beyond, or something more powerful. Um, and with that came an effect on how he behaved. Because one of the problems throughout philosophy has often been that philosophers come up with theories, but those theories never translate into action. But he was saying, "Oh no, they definitely do, especially if you start with your existence itself."